Does it work now? Yeah. So my team spends a long time, a majority of their time, talking to payers in various countries on a range of indications. And today's presentation will really focus on some key trends and takeaway points that we have discovered as we discuss reimbursement in a number of different diseases. So we'll really focus on the reimbursement challenges in the US and a number of European countries and the payers' increased focus on value. So briefly, let's go through the agenda. We'll have a short introduction discussing why payers are experiencing these tremendous pressures. We'll then look at the changing reimbursement policies across 3 European countries, the UK, France, and Germany. And then we'll move on to the US and look at some growing pricing pressures in that geography and also the emergence of the value frameworks. And then we'll look at some key trends and points of convergence across a number of different healthcare systems. And specifically, payers focus on outcomes and value and the changing evidence requirements. And we'll also look at the risk-sharing landscape across a number of markets. And then we'll look at some reimbursement challenges that are increasingly affecting orphan drugs. And we'll finish off with a summary of key conclusions and takeaway points. So let's begin with a brief introduction. So why are the payers experiencing this high level of pressures? On one hand, we have the aging population across a number of developed and emerging markets. And of course, the lifestyle changes are also leading to an increased prevalence of chronic conditions. On the other hand, there have been numerous medical advances. We have seen new drugs being approved that now extend patients' lives, and the patients need to take them for a number of years. If you look at multiple myeloma, which was previously a totally incurable fatal condition, nowadays multiple myeloma patients can live for a number of years, and they need to take those drugs for a number of years. And now we also have several combination treatments, so the costs of treating patients are increasing. But on the funding side, payers have less money. Since the economic recession, the growth has been slower than previously, which means that payers have to do more with less. And that is really putting a great pressure on them. And whereas the pharmaceuticals budget only takes up between maybe 10 to 18% of the total healthcare spend, it is an easy target to cut costs, much easier so than to cut the number of doctors and nurses. As a result, we have seen some new and changing pricing and reimbursement policies. So let's look at what's been happening in the UK. UK has traditionally been a harder market to get good access in. We'll briefly look at some key steps for market access in the UK. So NICE, the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, is the key decision maker and the first hurdle to be overcome. NICE does not assess every single drug that comes onto the UK market. They only assess drugs that have high budget impact potential or a significant impact on the management of the disease. And the basis of the NICE assessment is the health economic evaluation, where NICE assesses both the costs, the increase in cost of treating a patient with a new drug versus standard of care, as well as the increase in improvement in a patient outcome. And this analysis, the main output is the incremental cost-effectiveness ratio, which is equal to that increased cost of treating a patient over increase in patient benefit that is expressed as a quality-adjusted life years. And once NICE calculates that number, if the number for a particular drug falls below the 20 to 30,000 pounds threshold, NICE recommends the drug to be used routinely within the National Health Service. However, if that number is above the threshold, it does not recommend the drug to be used. The threshold can occasionally be raised to £50,000 per QALY for drugs that qualify under the end-of-life criteria. And it is important to note here that NICE is the health technology assessment body, the technical body. They don't hold any budgets. NHS England is the budget holder that needs to implement these decisions. And if a drug gets a positive NICE recommendation, NHS England needs to implement that decision within 3 months. And typically, getting that NICE recommendation has been the key market access step. And we've seen certainly for oncology treatments that that has been difficult on occasion. And there are quite a few examples of not getting market access in England. But increasingly what I've been seeing that it's not just about cost effectiveness, but affordability is becoming more relevant in the UK market. So one example I'd like to discuss here is of hepatitis C and Sovaldi. So when Sovaldi was approved for hepatitis C, it got through NICE assessment very easily. So NICE found the drug cost effective at list price. And some people were even surprised because we didn't expect that. But the fact is that it's such an effective drug that delivers a cure that the patient benefit was so significant that it was cost effective. But the problem was that because of the huge number of patients that were waiting to get the drug and that the drug cost was sizable, if all those patients were treated within a short period of time, they would have bankrupted the National Healthcare Service. So as a result, NHS had to institute patient prioritization criteria and to set the annual limits on the number of patients being treated. So it was much more about affordability. And this is becoming to play a greater role in access. So it's not just about being cost effective, but being affordable because the healthcare budgets work on an annual basis. And as a result of these bigger affordability pressures, a new rule was introduced just last month in April, under which there is a new annual budget ceiling. And the way this rule works is that for drugs that are found to be cost effective, so they fall under that £20,000 to £30,000 per quality threshold, there is a secondary criterion that needs to be considered. If their annual budget impact is projected to be £20 million or above in any of the first years on the market, the manufacturer needs to negotiate a price with NHS England. So it's not just about getting the price right to satisfy NICE. For drugs that have high cost or high potential volume, there will be a secondary negotiation that wasn't there before. And if there is no agreement between the sponsor and the NHS England, then NHS England has the right to ask NICE to advise them on more narrow patient criteria so that the drug's use can be phased in over a period of time. So we have this quite a big change in the UK market. It wasn't all negative. In this latest round of changes, they have also announced that the drugs that are super cost effective, so that fall below £10,000 per quality, they will be fast-tracked through NICE, and they'll get faster access. It's not exactly clear how all of these new rules will work out in practice. What will happen with that negotiated price after 3 years? Our payer respondents are indicated that there will be very limited willingness to increase the price post 3 years, but we are certainly going to be discussing this in all of our future payer studies and seeing how this new rule is implemented in practice. Overall, our predictions are that this new rule will mean that drugs that are cost effective but they high volume use or high price will find it more difficult. In a way, they'll be penalized. And the pricing pressures will intensify. And also, this will put the pressure on the manufacturers to analyze that price-volume relationship in even more detail than before. And whereas NICE already conducts a budget impact analysis, that has not been the focus on their assessment methodologically. So this will now become more of a point of negotiation and making sure that the manufacturer's estimates agree with NICE estimates. And secondly, we believe that the need for risk-sharing agreements in the UK will increase under these new rules and also for novel contracting approaches. UK has already been a fertile ground for risk-sharing agreements starting back a few years ago when there were outcomes-based schemes signed for some multiple sclerosis drugs as well as for multiple myeloma drugs. But because of their administrative burden, NICE and NHS England didn't like them anymore as much. So they moved more towards easier to implement patient access schemes that involved flat discounts off the list price. But with this new budget ceiling pressure, we believe that companies will need to think about novel arrangements such as total budget caps or price volume agreements. Per patient caps have been used in the past. There are some financial risk sharing schemes that have that structure, but not price volume agreements. And broadly speaking, unfortunately, this new rule does mean the market access environment in the UK will get tougher. It will mean more complex access negotiation, more preparation, and also greater commercial uncertainty, because this is a very new rule. We don't have clear clarity on how this is going to be implemented, and NHS England will reevaluate the rule in 3 years' time to think how to go forward. So if you're looking at some phase 2, phase 3 drugs that will only reach the market in a few years' time, there is that big uncertainty about what exactly will happen then. And of course, the big question that we all want to know is this sign of further restrictions that they may come? So we've looked at the UK. Now we're going to move on to France, which has traditionally been a much more generous market access environment for manufacturers. And I think broadly speaking, the payers can say that they get a good price for their reasonable price negotiated, and the manufacturers also get good return and few restrictions in terms of access. We'll briefly look at some key steps for market access in France. So once a drug gets approval through either centrally through the European Medicines Agency or through the French regulator ANSM, the first step is to go through the health technology assessment within the Transparency Commission. So the Transparency Commission within the High Health Authority, HAS, conducts a comparative clinical assessment of each drug. And the main outputs of that assessment are the SMR rating, the ASMR rating, and the target patient population. We're going to look into these ratings in the next slide, but here I'd like to point out that the SMR rating influences the reimbursement rate setting by the Union of Health Insurers, UNCAM, and on the other hand, the ASMR rating influences the pricing negotiation with the Economic Committee, SEPS. And once those two steps have been carried out, the drug gets listed on the reimbursement lists. So now let's look at what these ratings mean. When the Transparency Commission assesses a drug, the first question they ask is, does this drug work in this disease? What is the drug's risk-benefit ratio? And depending on their evaluation, they give the rating, which reflects that benefit. And the rating can have 5 different levels. Either it's insufficient, in which case there is no reimbursement, or it can be weak, moderate, major, important. And depending on that SMR rating, there is that influences the reimbursement rate. If a drug is found to be having a positive risk-benefit ratio, then the second question that the Transparency Commission addresses is, does this drug work better than the comparators in this disease? So it looks at the added medical benefit. And this value, added value, is expressed in the ASMR rating. And the ASMR rating can have 5 different levels. If there is no added benefit, then that's level 5. If there is a minor added benefit, then it is level 4. And there are 3 higher levels of added benefit, 1, 2, and 3, major, important, to moderate. And the ASMR rating influences the price negotiation with the Economic Committee. So if a drug gets ASMR rating between 1 and 3, that's the golden territory. In majority of cases, the manufacturer can then negotiate a price that has price comparable to the drug's price in Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. However, if it only has a minor added benefit, then the price gets negotiated and it can only be comparable or slightly above comparator treatments, the 5 to 10%. And if it has no added benefit versus comparators, then the price has to be lower. Now, let's look at the reimbursement lists. So there are 4 different reimbursement lists, and for a drug to be used, it needs to be included on one or multiple of these lists. The first list includes the drugs used in ambulatory outpatient setting that are oral drugs or self-injectable drugs. The second list, collectivité, impacts the drugs that are administered in a hospital setting, and they are typically reimbursed through the French diagnosis-related group system, the DRG system, under which the total care of the patient, so including both the physician, nursing time, bed time, are covered in a flat payment. So there's no separate fee just for the drug. And this mostly, in fact, covers cheaper generic treatments. And then there is the retrocession list, which is for those drugs that are prescribed by hospital specialists and they're actually dispensed by pharmacies that are in the hospital and not outside of the hospital. And the type of drugs this includes is antiretroviral agents or clotting factors in hemophilia, just some examples. And then finally, there is the list en sus, or on top of DRG list, which includes treatments that are delivered administered in the hospital, either inpatient or outpatient, that are infused treatments, so they can't be delivered outside of the hospital, and that have high cost, so that those DRG payments, the flat payments, are not enough to cover these high cost treatments. So if you're thinking about branded infused oncology agents such as Velcade or Keytruda, they would have to be on that list. They are on those lists. And a drug normally that is an infused treatment first gets listed on the second list, collectivité, and then there is a secondary negotiation to get on the list en sus. And in theory, as long as it gets the listing on the collectivité list, a drug can be used in a hospital, but the hospital would be losing money if they use that drug. So getting listed on this list en sus, or on top of the DRG list, is critical to get routine access to intravenous drugs in France. And this specific list has been the target of the recent cost containment. In the past, getting onto this list for intravenous treatments has not been a big hurdle. But since 2015, a new rule was introduced, and under this rule, not all drugs will automatically get onto the list. The drugs need to have that SMR rating, at least major or important. And secondly, the ASMR rating is also important. So it's previously ASMR rating only impacted the price negotiation, and now it impacts this listing. So the rules go, if a drug gets an ASMR rating between 1 and 3, that's not a problem. They get included on the list. So this is that rating that's very good for the pricing, and it's also very good for the listing here. But if a drug has only minor added benefit or no added benefit, so ASMR ratings 4 or 5, then it gets trickier. So there are 2 sets of scenarios. In the first scenario, if the drug's comparator is already on the list, then it's not a problem. So already, if the comparator is a high-cost infused agent, the new drug gets listed. But if there is no added benefit or minor added benefit, and the comparators are either oral agents or low-cost generics that are not on the list, then the drug won't be listed. And this is where the problem lies. So now let's look at what have been some examples of drugs that didn't get listed because of this new rule. Here we can see the majority of oncology treatments. We can see Xofigo for prostate cancer, Halaven for breast cancer, and a couple of more drugs. But the casualties, so to speak, have not been only in oncology. We can also see that Entyvio for Crohn's disease was not listed in here. And it's important to note that Entyvio did get listed for ulcerative colitis, and that listing on this list is not per drug, it's per indication. And with lots of oncology agents being approved in multiple indications, you can be in a situation where a drug is listed for one indication but not for another. And we certainly know for Xofigo that the manufacturer has been trying for years to try and get onto this list, but it's been really affected by this rule change. And this rule change has impacted new listings since 2015, but since 2016, it also impacts assessment of drugs that are already listed. So there is also a future risk of being delisted, being removed, and then not having routine access. So because of this rule change, we have been actively monitoring. Whenever we do a study in a new indication, we really look at whether this is potential risk. And this slide lists some of the agents, some of the drugs that we believe that either recent launches or future launches that our payer respondents or our research has identified as potential future at-risk listings. And you will see some high-profile drugs here, Kyprolis, so Simplicity for multiple myeloma, for example. And again, it's not just a risk for oncology drugs. We have recently done a study in multiple sclerosis, and our payer respondents have indicated that Roche's Ocrevus will probably not have any problems getting listed in primary progressive multiple sclerosis because of unmet need, but may struggle to get in onto the list in the earlier lines of therapy for the relapsing remitting disease. So this was a major change in 2015, but there was another major policy change in France that happened a couple of years earlier. So before this policy change that happened in 2013, Transparency Commission's assessment, or general French assessment, really focused on that comparative effectiveness analysis. And the cost was negotiated, the price was negotiated, but they didn't look at cost effectiveness. Since 2013, a new rule has been in place, and under this rule, certain drugs are required to undergo a health economic evaluation, a cost effectiveness assessment. This rule applies for drugs that have an annual budget impact projected to be of 20 million euros or above, and where the manufacturer is claiming that they have a high level of added benefits, so ASMR rating 1, 2, and 3. In those instances, the manufacturer has to submit a cost effectiveness analysis during their evaluation. And this analysis also includes that incremental cost effectiveness ratio. So the methodology is very similar to UK's NICE. Now, what is different from UK is that there is no threshold. There's no threshold where there is reimbursement or no reimbursement, but this evaluation influences the price negotiation with the economic committee SEPs. And they have indicated as well that they don't have thresholds that impact price negotiation formally, but we believe that as this committee gets more confident and comfortable with these economic evaluations, they will start to get a set of benchmarks. So what kind of cost effectiveness did we agree for multiple myeloma? What cost effectiveness did we agree for diabetes? They will start to use those benchmarks for future price negotiations. So to recap, France is still a good market to be in, but there have been some changes, which means that market access conditions for infused treatments are getting tougher. These drugs need to demonstrate significant benefit over their comparators if the comparators are oral or generic agents in order to get listing and appropriate reimbursement. And also, this is not just a risk at launch, but also products can be delisted in the future. For example, if their comparator goes generic. So it's something that we need to monitor. And our payer respondents have also indicated that this list on SUS was the first one to be targeted by this cost containment because of the growing oncology costs. But in the future, other lists, such as the retrocession lists, could also be the target. So we are very actively monitoring policy changes in this space. And finally, although there is no cost-effectiveness threshold in France that's being used, not formally, there is a risk that cutoffs could be introduced in the future. So we've looked at France, now let's look at Germany. Again, a good market to be in. And prior to 2011, the manufacturers had free pricing in Germany. But what happened in 2011 was a big policy change. The famous AMNOG law came in, under which all new drugs had to go an added benefit assessment that influences price negotiation. So we're going to go through the steps of the AMNOG assessment in a second, but before we do so, I wanted to highlight here in bold some key decision makers. First, the GBA, or the Federal Joint Committee, which is the key reimbursement decision maker. Secondly, IQWiG, which is the technical assessor. And finally, the National Association of the Statutory Health Insurers, which is the key body that negotiates the price with the manufacturers. So under this process, the manufacturer still has free drug pricing at launch. But at the same time, they need to submit their comparative effectiveness dossier to the GBA. The GBA then commissions IQWiG with doing the technical assessment, and IQWiG publishes their decision on whether a drug has added benefit versus comparator or not. This assessment is then under consultation, and the GBA deliberates on it, and after a further 3 months, the final added benefit assessment is published. If a drug is deemed to have an added benefit versus comparator treatment, then the manufacturer enters into a pricing negotiation with the National Association of the Statutory Health Insurers. And if they get to an agreement on the rebate, which means the price is lower than the list price, that price comes into effect after the first year on the market. If there is no agreement, they go into a whole arbitration procedure, but there's really been a small number of cases. The problem happens if there is no added benefit, and in that case, if the comparator is a cheap generic drug, that means a big problem for the manufacturer, and they may end up withdrawing from the market. It certainly happened in diabetes. However, if the comparator is a high-cost branded drug, then not getting an added benefit is not really a problem. So not getting an added benefit may not be bad news. It depends on what the comparator is. And it's important to note that it's not the manufacturer that decides what's the comparator, it's the GBA. So in Germany, there is still comparative effectiveness assessment, comparative clinical effectiveness, similar as in France, but there are some differences between those two processes. In Germany, the hallmark of the assessment is what we call salami slicing into patient subpopulations. And what I have here is the example of Jardiance in type 2 diabetes, which was assessed in 10 different patient subgroups, depending whether it's used as monotherapy, as dual therapy, what the adjunctive is, if it's triple therapy. And then each of these situations was cut into 2 further situations where the patient has or does not have cardiovascular disease. And the drug managed to get an added benefit in some of the patient populations, but not all. And then this added benefit level and the price of the comparator impact the price negotiation. A drug can get an added benefit only if it provides evidence that it impacts these 4 domains. Either it has to impact mortality or patient morbidity, or improve side effects of treatment, or improve health-related quality of life. So if it's just improved convenience, that's not an added benefit. And GBA and IQWiG have also become known for really strict methodology. This added benefit can be proven versus the comparator only if there is head-to-head comparison versus that adequate comparator therapy. Indirect comparisons have only been accepted in a couple of situations. So having head-to-head data versus the comparator that the GBA considers as adequate is very important. Secondly, it's about the endpoints. They are known for not accepted surrogate endpoints unless they are well validated, but it's very hard to convince them that the surrogate endpoint is well validated. What they want to see is what they call patient-relevant endpoints, and they define patient-relevant endpoints and endpoints that reflect how a patient survives, feels, or functions. And thirdly, that subgroup analysis is super important, but it can't be post hoc. So up to now, this added benefit assessment has been very important for price negotiation, but it has had limited impact on reimbursement because traditionally in Germany, reimbursement has to cover all of the approved label. But now that is starting to change. So just in March this year, there was a new legal change under which it paves the way for the prescribing system in Germany to change so that the physicians, when they make their prescription, they see whether the drug has an added benefit in each of the patient subpopulations, and they also see the price of the drug and the price of the comparator treatment. At the moment, your standard prescribers are not even aware of the AMNOG process that much. It's more about pharma manufacturers, consultants, and the payers. But under this new system, prescriber will be able to see all of that information, and potentially they will not be willing to prescribe a drug in a patient subgroup where there is no added benefit if the comparator treatment is cheaper. And the payers we have been speaking to think that they may institute measures that penalize physicians who do prescribe higher cost agents if they don't have an added benefit. This is a very recent change, and our payer respondents can't fully agree on how it will be implemented, but it does mean now that for those drugs that have that mixed added benefit assessment, so benefit in some patient subgroups and no added benefit in other patient subgroups, may be most at risk of having limited access. So we are very actively following the development of this healthcare policy. It will take a while for it to take hold on the ground. Some of our payers estimate end of this year. Some of them say it's going to take 2 years to change the prescribing systems, but certainly the added benefit assessment looks set to have even more of a relevance in Germany. A second trend in Germany that we want to discuss is the increasing practice of the health insurers, the so-called sickness funds, to contract for preferred drugs in exchange of rebates. Up to now, the healthcare insurers tended to do these rebate contracts mostly after patent expiry, so for preferred generics. But now they're starting to enter into rebate contracts for branded drugs in drug classes where there are multiple competing brands with limited differentiation. And what they do there, they negotiate a discount and they have a preferred brand, and they encourage their physicians to prescribe that brand as a first choice agent. As a result, we have higher levels of uptake of that preferred brand in certain regions where the drug is won the contract, and also the net price is being driven even further down than that negotiated price. And then in terms of future potential policy changes that could have an impact, we have identified another one, and that refers to the ceiling threshold on the first years of sales. At the moment, the manufacturer still has free pricing at launch, and it's only after the first year that the negotiated price comes into effect. But a new rule was proposed in 2016 under which those drugs that exceed first-year sales above 250 million euros would have that negotiated price apply retrospectively, so the payer would claw back the difference in price. Now, this rule was not passed into law, but our payer respondents tell us that they're happy that it wasn't passed into law because this number was way too high. Maybe Sovaldi and Harvoni and hepatitis C would have been affected, but the majority of drugs wouldn't reach this level of sales. So what they have told us more recently is that they're hoping that this rule will be implemented, but that the threshold will be much lower and that the number they would like to see is 50 million euros. So now that exposes many more drugs at risk of that first year sales being lower, or at least the payers clawing back the price. This is be a future change. Germany has the elections in 2017 in September, so nothing major will change until the end of this year when the new government takes hold, but certainly going forward we will want to keep an eye on whether a new threshold is introduced. So we've looked at Europe. Now let's look at the US. US has also experienced growing pricing pressures, and specifically in the specialty drug segment. So this is the high-cost drug segment. The expenditure on this segment has been increasing quite rapidly. You can see the 2014 number here being quite dramatic, 31%. And even though it's been declining, it's still a key concern for our payer respondents. And it's not just the volume that's increasing, but also the unit cost increases have been quite high in double-digit numbers, and the payers are concerned. This whole problem was exacerbated by the case of Sovaldi in hepatitis C, where the high patient numbers and the high price caught the payers by surprise and gave them a big headache. As a result, payers are now super active in terms of monitoring pipelines. So because they don't want to have another hepatitis C story, and they're specifically monitoring that for what they call budget busters, which is drugs that get approved in a disease where there was no previous treatment. So all of a sudden there is a drug cost, or if there is a high-cost drug being approved in an indication which is dominated by low-cost drugs, either brands or potentially generics. And also, they're becoming much more aggressive in terms of their contracting and the willingness to exclude a brand in exchange for a higher discount with a competing brand. At the same time, amid rising oncology costs and approvals of new treatments, there has been a focus. Oncology has become a number one priority for our payer respondents. And as it's become difficult to judge the value of new treatments, we've seen the emergence of several value-based frameworks in the US, which we'll discuss in a minute. So to demonstrate this increased payer pressures within the specialty segment, I like to discuss the example of PCSK9 inhibitors. These drugs to treat dyslipidemia have been approved and launched at high prices, specialty drug prices. These are not oncology drug prices, but still the $14,000 per patient annual cost qualifies them as specialty category. But these drugs also have high patient numbers. This is not a niche oncology indication, it's dyslipidemia. So they qualify under that budget buster category. On top of that, they were approved without cardiovascular outcomes data, just based on LDL-C lowering. As a result, they were met with a high level of patient restriction. On a level of 1 to 10, our payers say the restriction is level 9 to 10. So it's really high level of restriction. And they're restricting these drugs to patients who have failed multiple trials with statins and have demonstrated intolerance. Only a couple of months ago, Repatha, Amgen's Repatha, the first PCSK9, got cardiovascular outcomes data, which wasn't available before. The big question for everybody was, what happens now? Will the payers restrict access? So we went back to our payer respondents and asked them what they thought about that. And here is their response. They're saying it won't change anything. And the reasons for that are that 1.5 absolute risk reduction on the 3-endpoint MACE of myocardial infarction, stroke, and cardiovascular death is not impressive enough. It's not bad, but it's not high enough to justify the high price of the drug. They're highlighting that the number of patients needed to treat to prevent an event is too high relative to the price. And what I have on this slide is I have included several payer quotes directly from them, highlighting that point. They're saying, the outcomes are slightly less than they expected, but that's okay. The main problem is that the price is too high for the efficacy of the drug. And this is what the problem is. So the only circumstances under which they're willing to open up the access is if the price drops significantly within the range of $2,500 to $5,000 per year. So it's not about the outcomes, it's really about the cost. And I have included further payer quotes on this slide. The first two are from the US payers that are stating that in this particular instance, they consider that the manufacturers have really misjudged the payer sentiment. They have come into a high patient numbers indication and priced the drug way too high, which is why they reacted with such restrictions. So if you see some of the quotes, they're saying the message to the manufacturer is, you got this wrong. The second quote says, this is going to become a textbook example of how not to launch a drug. So understanding that payer sentiment is very important, because if manufacturers don't do that, they will be faced with big barriers. And this sentiment is not restricted just to the US payers. I have one French quote there, the last one, which illustrates that they think for this high price, the manufacturer should have focused on a much more narrow patient population and then potentially expanded it later on at a lower cost. Let's now move on to the value frameworks. So as I mentioned, oncology is the #1 concern for our payers in the US. And with the launch of new agents, it has become very difficult to judge their value. And also, oncology is not a category that the payers can restrict very easily in the US. It's a big public relations issue. So back a couple of years ago, we have seen several value frameworks being launched. You will see launched by ASCO, NCCN, so National Comprehensive Care Network, so Cancer Care Network. So these are big names in oncology management in the US, and also the drug abacus from the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And these are physician-led initiatives under which they evaluate oncology drugs and they give them ratings based on their efficacy, side effects, convenience, and costs. And they have different scopes, so how many drugs they assess, they have different methodologies and outputs, and also different strengths and limitations. And so far, their impact has been mostly on the prescribers and the patients' discussions in terms of deciding whether to have a fifth line of therapy, not so much on the payer side. The one value framework we'd like to highlight as having an impact of payers is the last one, which is the Institute for Clinical and Effectiveness Review, an economic review, ICER, which is based in Boston. It's a non-profit organization. And the remit of this organization, the scope of assessment is wider. It doesn't look only at oncology. It looks at pretty much what we would define as budget busters. And the analysis, the methodology of this organization is very close to UK's NICE. One of the key outputs is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. And they also look at that number, and then they come up with what they consider is a value-based price for the US market. So whereas the other frameworks don't explicitly look at that value in terms of both outcomes and cost, ICER does. And that has become something that resonates more with the payers. So we have been discussing with our payer respondents how they utilize this ICER in their decisions, and we've noticed that the trend is changing towards greater influence. So here what I have is some of the quotes from the payers to illustrate their thinking. And you will see in the first one that they're highlighting that the ICER serves as a good pressure on the manufacturers by raising awareness when a drug has been inappropriately priced. So it creates a public relations problem for the company that they need to deal with the US public. The second one illustrates that even though there is no direct cutoff level, this ICER assessment does give them another tool, another weapon in their price negotiation, and they see the influences increasing. There is still no clear consensus, so you will see that the third quote, the payer is reflecting on that, saying, well, unless there is a mandate for either FDA or ICER to become the decision maker, nothing will change as a major change. However, they do put that pressure in the public eye on the manufacturers. So slowly we are seeing that a cost element of value becoming more of a factor in the US decision making. So we've looked at the US and Europe. Now I'd like to move on some global points of convergence among the healthcare systems. So because of the increasing payer pressures, payers are focusing on outcomes and value. And if you talk to our payer respondents about what they see as value, there is a clear consensus. It's all about the outcomes, improvement in outcomes relative to the cost. So it's not just about improvement in outcomes. And if you look at that outcome side of the equation, they appreciate improvement in survival, in morbidity, safety, if a drug safety is an issue with existing treatments, and in some cases, quality of life. What they don't see a value that they want to pay more for is patient convenience or any arguments of improved adherence unless there is sound evidence to support that. And if you look at the costs, they think of both the total cost for treatment, they look at any impact on supportive care or any testing that's needed, and also potential impact on direct medical costs, such as hospitalizations and ER visits. And I think that the industry is in agreement with the payers in general, broadly speaking, about what is value. Where the problems arise is around whether that value proposition is supported by sound evidence. And this is what we often encounter when we discuss new treatments with our payer respondents. So here are some of the key takeaway points that we have come across a number of indications. Firstly, they want to see final and not surrogate endpoints. So if you're looking at oncology, increasingly progression-free survival has a limited impact on that added benefit assessment. In fact, in Germany, you cannot get an added benefit based on progression-free survival because it's not a patient-relevant endpoint. It's all about overall survival. If you're looking at type 2 diabetes, it's around cardiovascular outcomes or reduction in hypoglycemic events and not HbA1c, which is a surrogate endpoint. Also, what's really important, and we hear this all the time, is they want to see absolute risk reduction data. They do not like relative risk reduction to be presented to them. And it's all about number needed to treat to prevent an event, especially in cardiovascular diseases. So to give you some examples, payers view Entresto positively because it demonstrated a 5% absolute risk reduction on cardiovascular death and hospitalizations. There was 20% relative risk reduction, but translated to a 5% absolute risk reduction, and these are severe patients. But they did not like Repatha's, or they weren't enthused about Repatha's 1.5 absolute risk reduction, even though there was that 20% relative risk reduction, same of Entresto, and this is where they're stressing, I want to hear the absolute risk reduction numbers. Also, we recently did a study on oral anticoagulants, and they stressed that this low level of just 1% reduction in severe bleeds versus warfarin led to a very high number needed to treat, and as a result, access in some markets has been restricted. Head-to-head trials, again, we can't hear enough of this in our payer interviews. They always stress that head-to-head trials versus standard of care are key, and they get very disappointed when they see a new drug coming in that doesn't have an appropriate phase 3 program. So to give you some examples, they view Cosentyx in psoriasis positively because the drug was compared versus and beat both Enbrel and Stelara. But the new biologics that are now entering rheumatoid arthritis that were only compared to Humira in a minority of patients are not viewed as positively. They consider them to have failed to differentiate versus Actemra and will only manage to get a very small piece of that RA pie. And then lastly, health economic outcomes are really starting to resonate way more than before with the payer respondents. The endpoints we hear about a lot is reduction in hospitalizations and emergency room visits, and this is what Entresto got right. Or if you're looking at type 2 diabetes, they don't want to hear about reduction in nocturnal hypoglycemic events. They want to hear about reduction in hospitalizations resulting from hypoglycemic events, because that's a much more payer-relevant endpoint that feeds into their cost lines. So it's great if you have good evidence base and you tick all the boxes with the payers, but what happens if your drug gets approved without mature data? So this has increasingly been the case with a growing number of drugs going through accelerated approvals, both in Europe and the US. And in these situations, drug gets approved based on immature data and surrogate endpoints. And there is a further data collection required by the regulators. But in the meantime, the health technology assessment bodies and the payers have to make access decisions based on that limited data set. And often they're facing pressures from the patient groups to give access because these are breakthrough treatments where there's a huge unmet need. So this is creating a huge problem for them and of course for the manufacturers who have to satisfy payers. So we have been taking pulse of what the opinion has been on the payer side in terms of what solutions can be found to solve this problem. And some of the key messages we've been hearing, often from conferences, is that it's super important to engage in that early scientific advice, both with the regulators and the HTAs. And there's several pilot programs in Europe that enable that multiple stakeholder dialogues. So to ensure that that evidence generation plan does not satisfy just the regulators, but also the payers. And it is worth adding extra points of data collection and increasing the cost of that program if it means that you will have adequate data to show the value proposition of the drug. And also what I keep on stressing is that there is a need to be realistic about the pricing that can be achieved before the first full data is available. And that applies to both parties, to stop having that adversarial mentality of, well, I have to get my price high, otherwise the payers can only drive it down. And then the payers think, oh, well, I have to keep the price down, otherwise I can never get it down later on. And the one way to address this problem that has been proposed is really to engage in risk sharing, but to be very smart about how those risk sharing agreements have been signed so that there is a premeditation and preparation for future scenarios. So not just think about the pricing before the data comes in, but also to have scenarios, well, what happens with the price if your survival improvement is in this range? What happens with the price if the survival improvement is this lower range? And that way to minimize that risk for both parties. And this is something that several different platforms in Europe that are trying to get all the stakeholders to agree on and change the mentality in the negotiation process. And this brings us to discussion of risk sharing. So risk-sharing agreements are generally used to address uncertainty. And that uncertainty can either be on the financial side, so around the total budget impact, the total per patient costs, and there are financial-based risk-sharing schemes such as cost-capping agreements to address that. Or the uncertainty can be on the outcome side, around when immature data is not available, when the efficacy in the real world could be lower than in the trial setting. And this is where the outcomes-based risk-sharing agreements come into play. Now, the way that these agreements have played out in practice has been very variable across markets. And here we have a summary of what these look like in Europe. And if these countries are ordered from top to bottom, from the more active risk-sharing countries to less active, such as Germany. UK, as we've already mentioned, has had a longer history of risk sharing, although with these recent changes, the price volume agreements may come more into play. Italy has been using managed entry agreements and registries for oncology drugs in particular for a period of time. And in France, traditionally, price volume agreements have been used, but we've seen some instances more recently of outcomes-based risk-sharing schemes. One was done for Pomalyst in multiple myeloma not long ago, so there is a change in attitude. And in Spain, the Catalonian region, which is one of the most important regions in Spain, has been really proactive about risk sharing. And we've seen several risk shares there for rheumatoid arthritis, potentially some more for multiple sclerosis, and so on. Germany has been the one outlier in that they're not particularly interested in that. But recently, there's been a law change that now sets a framework for the payers to start engaging in price volume agreements. This has been passed very recently, and over the course of the next year, the payers will be hammering out how that's going to work in practice. But our payer respondents who are involved in this process have highlighted that this has been specifically triggered by oncology rising costs and use of combination treatments, where you have two different brands used in some patients, sometimes in monotherapy, sometimes in dual therapy, and they want to find novel ways to manage the costs in those categories. So we'll certainly be paying attention to how that evolves. And in the US, there's been also an uptick in risk-sharing agreements there. So this has been in specific pockets, either large insurers that have the capacity to carry out these deals, or some smaller innovative payers that have integrated electronic medical records. But overall, there is a shift in mentality. Our payer respondents who a year ago would have said, I don't want to do that, it's too complex, not for me, are now starting to say, well, yeah, I could think about that. It may not materialize into a signed deal yet, but there's clearly a shift in the mindset. And if you look at the active publicized agreements and look at the drugs that have been dominating those, they have certainly been more around the cardiovascular treatments, which is in contrast with Europe, where it's been more about oncology. So it'll be interesting to see if payers finally start to have a bit more courage of entering into these agreements in oncology space. And as this is a new trend in the US, there is an understanding among the payers that the savings from these agreements may not materialize immediately, but they acknowledge that they're important as an experiment to see what works best, what doesn't work, and also to drive the creation of the infrastructure and the data collection system to support future agreements. And some of them have stressed that they want to engage in these agreements because they want to make it clear to the manufacturers that they need to focus on those payer-relevant outcomes. So we've looked at these key points of convergence, and I'd like to now briefly look at the orphan drugs and the reimbursement challenges that they're starting to face. Orphan drugs have generally been exempt, so managed to evade challenges. And on this slide here, I have highlighted the processes, specific processes for orphan drugs in some countries. So we can see that majority of countries, there is no specific assessment process for orphans, apart from the UK for ultra-rare diseases. But there are exemptions, there are relaxed criteria. So in the UK, for ultra-rare diseases, that cost-effectiveness threshold has recently been raised to £300,000 per QALY. And in France and Italy, there are relaxed criteria a bit more informally. And in Germany, there is a clear exemption for orphan drugs. So if you look at Germany, orphan drugs only have to submit a simplified dossier under the AMNOG benefit assessment, as long as the first year in sales does not exceed 50 million euros. And by law, they have to be given an added benefit. They can't get no added benefit. This exemption disappears if their sales exceed 50 million euros per year, in which case they have to undergo full assessment and they can have no added benefit, and they have tougher price negotiations. And during the 2016 legislative changes discussion, payers wanted this exemption to be removed. This was not passed into the final law, so this exemption for orphan drugs still exists, but lots of our payer respondents have indicated that they're going to push to see that exemption removed in the future. So there is a bigger pressure on orphans. And we have a couple of examples here that illustrate that pressure. So Strensiq, Alexion's drug, did fairly well in the health technology assessment in France and in Germany. But in the UK, it has a restriction to use only in early onset patients. And the company's drug, Kanuma, which is very highly priced for an ultra-rare disease, had an even tougher path. So it went fine through the assessment in Germany because of that legal exemption. But in France, it only got a minor added benefit because of the uncertainties around the evidence base, and the manufacturer withdrew the submission. So, and we can remember that this ASMR 4 creates problems in terms of the getting onto the right list. So they really need to get ASMR 3. And in the UK, the drug was rejected by NICE, and this is despite Alexion having proposed annual per patient cost cap regardless of the dosing, a discount to the price per mg, and a total budget cap. But the uncertainty lies in the evidence-based and the outcome. So potentially this is a key target where that outcomes-based deal would be much more appropriate. And finally, in the US, where orphans typically have no barriers, Sarepta's Duchenne's drug, which had a rough path through the FDA as well, had some payer barriers. There were several insurers that refused to cover the drug. Recently, we have heard some news that that is changing as patient groups and experts start to put pressure on the manufacturers, but it just illustrates the point that orphans are no longer safe. And as a lot of new drugs come through these accelerated approvals, and also looking more broadly at regenerative medicine as well, there will be greater payer pressure. So to recap some key takeaways, I think there's still a number of countries in Europe and of course in the US where the manufacturers can get good return on their investment without a doubt, but the financial pressures are leading to some challenges and also to new cost containment policies. And as you can see through these examples of some European countries, reimbursement landscape is undergoing very frequent changes. So these new policies are popping up every year. So it's very important to keep track of them. Also, cost effectiveness, but also affordability is becoming top of mind of payers. So we have heard the mention of threshold, £20 million in the UK, threshold in Germany, threshold in France. That affordability and the budget impact is what they really need to keep on track. And this is resulting in these new policies. And as a result, pricing will unfortunately continue to experience the downward pressure. And if you think about evidence generation, satisfying with payers in mind, has to be a top priority to market a differentiated treatment. However, even then, it's important to note that the willingness to pay for added value is limited. I often hear payers saying, well, I've upgraded from iPad 4 to iPad 5 and I didn't have to pay more for it. Why should I pay more for this new drug where the comparative treatment is already high cost? It's surprising how often I hear that. And so even those differentiated products will need to consider pricing very carefully, and we've seen the US market moving in that direction. And finally, innovative contracting will play a great role. There has been an increased willingness on the payer side to engage in these agreements, but these risk-sharing agreements will take a different form in each market, which makes the management much more complex. And of course, in the future, they will be supported by new data and analytics methods that are currently in development.